Get started. Good morning. Hi.
Good morning.
I want to thank everyone for joining us. My name is Danny Nierenberg, and I work for an organization called Food Tank. And for those of you who don't know us, we're a research and advocacy organization really devoted to telling stories of hope and success in food and agriculture systems around the globe. And we do this with the aim to inspire, motivate, and ultimately activate positive transformation in how we produce and consume food. I am so honored to be here, and I want to start by welcoming everyone to the Crops That Nourish Convening and give a huge thanks to the organizers for making this event possible, including CIMMYT, the U.S. State Department's Office of the Special Envoy for Global Food Security, and the Johns Hopkins Institute for Planetary Health. Please give them all a round of applause. I want to get just a little bit of housekeeping out of the way. The bathrooms are outside. There's good signage, so whenever you need that, they're out there. And now I want to talk about why we're all here. This is a really pivotal and critical moment the world faces. We're experiencing not one, but multiple crises of climate, biodiversity loss, and hunger, and of course, malnutrition. My friend, Dr. Evan Fraser, who is here, says what we're in the middle of is really cascading crises, and the need for action has never been greater. But we have the solutions, and initiatives like the Vision for Adapted Crops and Soils are ensuring that nutritious, climate resilient crops, or opportunity crops, as Dr. Fowler likes to call them. These crops, as we all know, have been overlooked for far too long, but they're getting the attention that they finally need. And importantly, they're getting more investment. And we need collaboration among researchers, farmers, nutrition experts, and other stakeholders so we can have diversity of foods, diversity of practices, diversity of people, and diversity of thought. This event brings together an incredible group of agriculture, food security, and environmental experts for 2 days of keynote addresses, breakout sessions, and panel discussions. And I'm incredibly honored to be here and learn from all of you as we work to set an agenda for the crops that will nourish both people and the planet in the future. We're going to begin the day with opening remarks from the three co-hosts, and I'm so excited to welcome to the stage Sieglin Snap, the Director of Sustainable Agri-Food Systems Programs at CIMMYT. She's one of my personal heroes, so please give her a round of applause.
So good morning. It is so much fun to see you all here. I feel really blessed. I'm sorry Kevin Murphy's not with us because he's a plant breeder at Washington State. He and I just dreamed this up, to be honest. I think it's actually all of you were in our consciousness. It was dreamed together. We were wandering through St. Louis Botanical Garden and said, you know, as the world's starting to think about this diversification, what about if we all came together and helped build this vision? And I said, yeah, the crops that nourish. And he's like, yeah, that's a good name. And so it just all was meant to be. So all of you, thank you from the bottom of my heart. It's so wonderful to be together, have this really special time. Because in fact, you know, the Green Revolution did help feed people, and that helps, you know, prevent wars. The fact that, as Borlaug says, that, you know, you can only have peace if you have a full stomach. But we didn't always nourish the planet, right, along the way. We didn't always nourish the soils, the babies, the whole ecosystem, livelihoods. That part, you know, we got calories, which is really, really important, but did we really nourish ourselves working together? And so we are so grateful this time to help this idea of opportunity crops is coming most recently. I think it's been in the world for many years, but coming out with the support from the State Department's Special Envoy for Food Security. And so just to take a little bit of a whirlwind to remind us why crop diversity is so important. So the challenges we all know, unfortunately, it's, everywhere I've been going in the world, we've had to deal with floods and unseasonable snow and drought. I just coming from Southern Africa, where Malawi is very dear to my heart and seeing people struggle. But there's also another crisis, which if you are a soil scientist, you would know that there's that slow push under our feet all the time. Soils are degrading. Some of them are being ameliorated, right? Farmers do improve the soil health. Let's not forget that. But there's this, and I used to think I was not very popular as a soil scientist because I would say, well, actually, if it was as bad as we always are saying, there'd be no soils left, right? We really are so much erosion happening. So I was thinking, well, maybe we've overstated the crisis. Unfortunately, I was wrong in that remote sensing is now showing us things are not as green as they should be. And that's partly weather extremes, but it's partly we're just not getting the response that we used to. So soil health with our intensification is a problem. And then farmers have to deal with price dynamics. So we have all these challenges, and we know that simplification has been a way that the world's coped with not enough calories. But there is a cost of simplification of just having a few crops in the world. And one of them is that now we're having to move out of the valleys, the alluvial plains that fed the world, into steeper places because we're just not getting enough nutrition out of our current agricultural systems. They're not supporting all of us the way it needs to. And so soils both in the fertile valleys and on the hills are getting degraded. So how do we bring back the diversification? And even places like India, which is one of the most diverse cropping systems in the world, with these amazing pulses that we know are so important for nutrition. Unfortunately, as you can see in this graph, other than maize, which has slightly come up, and obviously wheat and rice continue to go up, almost all the other crops are flatlined or going down. So this is sometimes called the lock-in trap, and I'm going to come back to that. That because India government is very committed, and this is where the Green Revolution, right, and one of the really manifestations of it was the varieties, and many of you are plant breeders here, and I know that you helped bring the short-statured wheat and rice that actually were higher yielding, so that's brilliant. And then the government has set up systems so that wheat and rice is then distributed other places so that people get calories. But it means that there's kind of a lock-in trap in that many policies don't support other crops, right? And so there's not always a floor on the markets. And so people keep growing what they know they can sell, and it will feed people, but will it nourish people? Will it nourish the planet? So we do have hope too, and we're going to be hearing some examples like in Southern Africa, where there's been these shifts. Since I worked since 1993, right, Melinda, go way back to then, in Malawi, all I saw when I first came to Malawi was maize, as far as you can see. It looks like Iowa. And I never thought it would change from that. Maybe a little diversification, intercrops here and there. Maybe some agroforestry, but we just thought there would be maize. That is life in Malawi. But now you see others crops there. And so there can be shifts. So it is possible we can get out of some of these lock-in traps. And we're also going to hear from other examples around the world of that, because I think we need this, because otherwise we're not going to see the nutritional gains. And this, Natalia is one of the, here, Felicia, and is one of the authors of this paper, showing us that, again, nutritional gains come from not just having calorie-rich crops. There's reasons people grow maize. And of course, being from Simit, I think maize is amazing. It, does produce a lot of calories. And it also is very easy, labor, and so on. But if you diversify it with beans, with pumpkins, with potatoes, you can see the green across the top where you actually get all of the iron and the vitamin C and all the other things that we all need. So I think that these classic MILPA systems, but even updated ones, agroecology, strip intercrops and such, have a lot to offer. But you may not know this, but soil organic carbon, which we always talk about as a win-win, right? That if we could just retain more soil carbon in the soil, then it would buffer, it would provide adaptation services, right? As the climate changes and retain more water, but also would be sink for carbon, which of course we would rather see in the soil. So, but you can't do that just with soil management. Conservation agriculture, reducing tillage is not enough. You have to have crop diversity there. So those go hand in hand together. And also in certain areas, crop yields, when you do conservation agriculture, requires having this diversification. So it's just a simple, from these meta-analysis, we're seeing more and more that you have to have that. But what do we mean? So we have all these advantages of crop diversity. So many meta-analyses are showing that. And I had a whole bunch more slides, but I took those out. You know the story that diversification matters, but the world is not doing diversification. It's intensifying, simplifying. So how do we find a middle way? And that's, I'm looking to all of you, and that's something that I know that you're going to make progress on next few days. But then also think about what type of diversity do we want? So again, this is a geeky conference. We're going to be thinking about functional diversity. Is it enough to just have different genetics of millet and sorghum, like shown on the right there? Or is it enough to, or do we need to do the classic, what farmers have found around the world, where you have completely different types of crops, one that replenishes the soil, the legume, the other one that then turns that into calories, right? So some sort of cereal and legumes. Or do we need something in the middle that has redundancy in it, like two legumes together? Who knew? You can rehabilitate the soil and produce lots of food along the way, right? If we have two of the similar types, but then maybe different growth durations, maybe complementary root systems. So thinking about this as a system is one of the really key things, I think, in this meeting. And then how are we going to get there? And this is, plant breeders have historically, wanted to have a uniform background, like be able to see their genetic gains, right? In perfect conditions. And so we have many research stations around the world with irrigation and lots of fertilizer, and they can see their genetic gain. That's fantastic. But now with the newer tools, and this is really to you VAX fellows in the room, think about how can you take it to the next step? Because when you look on the left and you see a research station, it doesn't look at all like, and this is still a sorghum on the right, but they look totally different, don't they? I'll just tell one story, because this is the fun thing about working in Africa. You get these amazing stories. I was once, I think Ava, I may have been had Ava and Fred there. We were in West Africa, and there was this elder that got up, and he told us, you plant breeders have brought us beautiful, beautiful sorghums. These are like dog's heads. They have, gorgeous black and white spots, and they're really gorgeous. However, thank you for those sorghums. But we don't eat dog's heads here. We eat sheep's heads. And he sat down. We're breeding something, a beautiful dog's heads, but he wanted sheep's heads. And so we have to remember that we aren't always, when you look at the sorghum on the left, it doesn't look what farmers are actually looking for on the right. So maybe in the middle, and maybe if this is involving working on farm, we can engage stakeholders to find out what they want, right? So we can find out what type of traits. If they're looking for crops that nourish the soil, then maybe we need to be looking for different traits in addition to yield gains. So we need perhaps soil-aware crops, right? That are assessed on representative soils. One of my earliest papers in my career, I found out that a lot of the soil carbon levels and phosphorus levels on research stations around Southern Africa were like 3 or 4 times higher than on farmers' fields right outside the fenced gate of the research station. So again, finding representative soils may require going on farm. But the good news is you can do that now. It used to be too challenging, right? Super complex, super heterogeneous, but we can do that now because we have bigger data, we have ability to rapidly assess what people are thinking, and then also ways to really interact with people. Even in this days of AI, I think we can interact too as people, as we're going to do in this next few days. So generation of this type of knowledge, I think, is really how do we do that in a very people-centric, very conscious way is one of our challenges here. And thinking, of course, about the fact that a woman should have a voice, but also different women positioned in the household, whether they're head of household or a young wife or a grandmother, they all have their positionality and should have a voice. So finally, I think to realize crops that nourish, I just want to put a few thoughts out here. I think we need to be thinking about prioritizing investments, and this is coming out in a paper in Nature Sustainability, thinking about the soil side especially, that maybe we can't heal the planet everywhere, that there's certain areas where we can really start with communities where you get a return. So we target soils where we can protect the soil health and where we can get a good return. And maybe enabling policies, because if we just produce new dogs' heads and yet policies are all about sheep's heads, we won't see what we need. So we have to have enabling policies. Farmers need a voice. I think we can all agree on that, but also they need an informed voice. It's not enough to be romanticize farmers and say, oh, I'd love to sit with you. I've found time and time again, they say, but what are you bringing to the table? So we have devices now where we can tell them, this is your soil carbon here. This is how much zinc is in this crop. So we can give them information that then they make choices. Not prescriptive saying you need this much fertilizer, but here's your options. This is, the most challenging part of your farm. What are you thinking about doing? What can you learn from your neighbor? And here's some more information. So I think coming up with indicators, and that can also help policy. I was fortunate to be in Nepal 2 weeks ago, where the government there has put online a soils map, which sounds like, well, of course, in this day of open data, right? No, actually, there's very few countries that have made accessible, not just the grids data, the general soils data that FAO and others hold for the world, but the actual detail for that country. They used it to decide in the fertilizer crisis where to put which fertilizers. They're keeping updating it with soil health information so that farmers have a soil health card, but they know something to do with that. So I think Nepal has really shown us the way that you can actually use these for policymaking as well as locally. And then this is very knowledge intensive, folks. If we're gonna take crops that nourish and realize the kind of resilient agri-food systems that we all want, then I think we need to promote a learning agenda. And there's a different type of extension. It's about education, which I think it always is. The extension educators I've met over the year are catalysts that really try to support a learning agenda with the farmers they serve. So how do we do that at scale is really one of the big questions. So finally, I really turn to you to learn together over the next few days how we can break these lock-in traps. We're currently trapped in a system that keeps reinforcing simplification. And yet we know from all the science that diversity is the foundation of nature's benefits. Diversity improves diets and livelihoods. So what kind of diversity? Maybe it's not a lot. Maybe it's just getting soybeans and wheat back in landscapes that are now just all one crop, right? Maybe it's functional diversity. Maybe we need brand new types of crops, like pigeon bee. You knew I was going to bring in pigeon bee at some point. This bush that also produces food that releases, solubilizes phosphorus, fixes nitrogen. So maybe we need new types of crops that will help us with these impact pathways to help nourish the planet. So thanks very much, and I can't wait to see what you guys do in the next few days. Thank you.
I love how excited Sid gets, and I love how intentional we're making this program. This is so great. I'd now like to welcome Sam Myers, the founding director of the Johns Hopkins Institute for Planetary Health at Johns Hopkins University. Please give him a round of applause as he takes the stage.
Thanks, Danny. It's so nice to be here with all of you and wonderful to welcome you all to this building and to Johns Hopkins. It's great to be co-hosting along with Sumit and the U.S. Department of State Special Envoy on Global Food Security as the Johns Hopkins Institute for Planetary Health. Let's see if I can figure out my slides. There we go. So I'm going to provide a little bit of a big picture context and not talk very long because I'm not a crop scientist. But the big picture is this global field of planetary health, which is a really new cross-disciplinary field that's focused on understanding the sort of human health impacts of are really vast global destabilization of all of our planet's natural systems. And the sort of core precept of this field is that the way we've come to live over the last several decades is now exceeding our planet's capacities, either to absorb the waste that we're producing or to provide the resources that we are using sustainably. And as a result, our activities collectively are transforming not only the climate system, but driving the sixth mass extinction of life on Earth, changing biogeochemical cycles, driving global scale pollution, driving scarcity of resources like fresh water and arable land, and that all of these large-scale anthropogenic environmental changes are interacting with each other in ways that we're just really coming to understand, but that affect the foundational conditions for human health and well-being. The quality and quantity of food that we can produce, the quality of air that we breathe, our exposure to infectious diseases or extreme weather events like the one taking place in Florida as we speak, and even increasingly the habitability of many of the places that we live. And we're starting to see really very large, significant burdens of disease across every dimension of human health, certainly including nutrition, but also infectious diseases, mental health, non-communicable diseases, displacement and conflict. And so understanding those dynamics and thinking about how we address this situation is really at the core of the field of planetary health. Now, interestingly, there's a sort of bidirectional relationship. So you see nutrition on the end of this change as something that's impacted by changing biophysical conditions. But of course, it's also the main driver of altered biophysical conditions. And so if we think about, the food system itself, it's become the dominant force driving the Earth crisis, right? Every year to feed ourselves, we use about 40% of the terrestrial land surface for croplands and pasture. We use about half the accessible freshwater on the planet, mostly to irrigate our crops. We fish 90% of monitored fisheries at or well beyond maximum sustainable limits. Much of deforestation, of cutting down about half the tropical and temperate forests on the planet, is driven by agricultural extension. Historically, we've dammed 60% and on our way to about 92% of the world's rivers. So all of these huge impacts across our planet's natural life support systems are primarily driven by our food system. And in the process, as you know, we're struggling with this growing global scale problem of pollution of air, water, and soil, disrupting the climate system, and this biodiversity crisis where I think to me, the most striking sort of way to wrap your head around the biodiversity crisis is this one statistic that of all mammalian biomass on the planet, 36% of that biomass is us, human beings, 62%, 34% is us, 62% is our livestock. And 4% of all mammalian biomass on the planet now is wild mammals. And so it's really striking to understand the extent to which humanity is sort of the driving force of changing biophysical conditions. Let's see if I can go the other direction. Yeah, sort of. But now let's turn it around and ask, so how are these changing biophysical conditions affecting nutrition and food production? And, I'm going to tell you three very, very quick case studies from my own research, just as examples. So the first is work that we've done showing that when we grow staple food crops at elevated carbon dioxide levels, the levels we expect to see by the middle of this century, what we find is significant reductions in iron, zinc, and protein in staple food crops like maize and rice and wheat. And when we've actually modeled how these changes in the nutrient content of our food crops will impact the total intake for populations across around 150 countries around the world, what we find is that we're at risk of pushing between 100 and 200 million people into new micronutrient deficiencies in addition to the roughly 1 billion people who already are suffering from those deficiencies. So very large impact on micronutrient nutrition. We've also done a lot of work on how pollinator declines and the loss of wild pollinators is impacting human health, and recently published a paper showing that there are about 500,000 excess deaths every year today because we don't have enough wild pollinators to actually optimize production of things like fruits, vegetables, and nuts, which play a really important role in protecting us from things like heart disease and stroke and diabetes. And so, again, this is how these biophysical changes are affecting nutrition and health. And then we've also done work in fisheries showing that there are about 1 billion people on the planet who are depending on wild harvested fish to get critical levels of nutrients like omega-3 fatty acids, vitamin A, iron, and zinc, and who will lose access to those nutrients as global ocean warming moves the distribution and the size of fisheries away from the tropics and toward the poles. And so, again, there are a lot of ways, some of them not very intuitive, that our transformation of our planet's natural systems is coming back to affect our own health and nutrition. And, broadly, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but if you look sort of around the bottom of this sort of Gordian knot, you see, all of these different kinds of biophysical change, each one of which represents a risk to a food production system that's been developed to function under relatively stable conditions in which we are now changing at the fastest rate in the history of our species. And you see that the global food security numbers after decades of great success have started to turn the other direction. So I think that sort of where we find ourselves in the context for the conversation we're having over the next 2 days is this, what I think of as sort of quadruple challenge, or what Evan last night boiled down to doing more with less. But essentially, how do we increase food production globally to keep up with demand and meet the needs of 10 billion people? How do we do it while improving the sort of nutritional package associated with the food that we're delivering to address the malnutrition and obesity crises that we face? Doing it in a way that actually reduces the impact of the food system on a biosphere that's fundamentally starting to crumble under the weight of our own ecological footprint, and do it in a way that reduces the vulnerability of food production to these destabilized biophysical conditions. And so it's a very tall order. It's a sort of threading the needle that we were talking about in this group. And I would argue that sort of one of the key cornerstones in slaying this four-headed monster, right, is figuring out how we begin to adopt these plant-forward diets based on diverse, resilient, and eco-friendly crops. And so the conversation that we're having today is actually a critical conversation in the broader context of the planetary health challenges that we face. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sam. I'm so glad that Johns Hopkins created this institute. It's needed now more than ever. It is now my pleasure to close out this session with Anna Nelson, the Deputy Special Envoy for Global Food Security at the U.S. State Department. Please give her a round of applause.
Good morning. So first of all, I'm so pleased that the U.S. State Department is able to co-host this with CIMMYT and with SAIS. It's really such an incredible group of people with such broad and diverse experience that we've been able to bring together. So kudos in particular to our organizers, Tiffany and Katie. Big thanks for getting us here today. So we're here to figure out how to drive VAX forward, how to realize the vision for adapted crops and soils. And what is the vision? I know a lot of people in this room have touched it in various different ways. And we say the vision is to build resilient food systems through climate adapted, diverse, and nutritious crops grown in healthy soils. And I'll defer to my colleague Jeff to go into greater detail on the VAX approach later on this morning. But VAX is about food security. It's about nutrition security. It's about sustainable land management, sustainable land use, and sort of permeating all of that. I typically say permeating all of that is climate change. But I'll say today that permeating all of that is our quadruple planetary health challenges. So I will better learn from my co-host here on that. And I think what we hope to do through VAX is make the argument, like so many in this room, that we need to tackle all of those things together. And we have a contention that a way to do that, a powerful way to tackle them all together, is through climate adapted crops, diverse climate adapted crops, and healthy soils. So I think, one is always supposed to have a call to action. So my call to action for this group today is to really embrace the integration, the four-headed dragon here, and try to think about how VAX can address all of these issues together, and to think about how crops and soils together can do it. Even within the VAX family, we are so often drawn to team crops and team soils. So I'm hoping everyone can lay aside their various team hats that they come to this event with, and put on their Team VAX hats, and think about these things again in a really integrated way. That's really how we try to again think of all these issues that we also all care so passionately about together. And then we also like to say that VAX is a movement, and we say that because so many people in so many different ways have stood up to advance VAX in whatever way makes sense to them and whatever way they're able to. And I think that is what is so exciting about it. All of you here, you're part of it because you showed up today, and many of you are already part of it in many, many other ways. We're so proud to have governments join the United States government in advancing it, in mobilizing resources for it, always important. We're proud to have companies in their own ways pledge to advance VAX through our VAX champions and others. And I think most of all, we're really proud of the VAX community practice. Many members here, including working group leads, but who represent the many, many different types of actors, of people from all different fields and all different places all across the world, who have said, I'm gonna put some of my own time and effort towards this shared vision. So my second call to action is don't feel constrained by any of the kind of formal VAX channels we have. I really I encourage all of you to think about in your own professional lives or personal lives how you can carry forward everything we talk about over the next 2 days, kind of the VAX philosophy, into the work you do in your own institutions. Because it's not through a single program that we're going to make this change. It's through everyone bringing, again, these philosophies to everything they're doing in every part of their life. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Anna. It's so nice to see VAX becoming this movement. And I want to thank Anna for her service to our country. It's incredible work that you're doing. Thank you so much. We're now going to have 2 keynote addresses to look at why crops that nourish are enablers of sustainable agri-food systems. And so first we have Julia Sabia, the president of the African Breeding Association and an associate professor of plant breeding at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Thank you for being here. Round of applause.
So I'm Julia, CBM, and as introduced from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, I'm a plant breeder by profession. And I'm also working with CIMIT for the VAX Vision for Adapted Crops and Soils Capacity, which is under the Feed the Future program of the USAID. And I've been so busy. Last week I was in Nairobi for a kickoff meeting for the VAX capacity, where we had 30 fellows that will be capacitated for breeding for these VAX crops. Working also with the VAX breeding, which is being led by Kevin Pixley, the VAX capacity under SIG. And I'm also happy to just say we also have some hubs. What we selected is flagship hubs for Africa for this particular training. And one of the representatives of those hubs is in this room, from Eric Dangwa from West African Center for Crop Improvement. So it's one of our hubs, and we have the other hubs is IITA and Baker, Erie. So we're trying to bring all the technologies that we can to capacitate our breeders. So technology.
I'm not sure I can help you, but I can. This one isn't working.
Okay, so the theme for this session is actually crops that nourish as enablers of sustainable agri-food systems. And so when I was given this topic, I'm thinking, okay, I'm a plant breeder, and as plant breeders, we're used to breeding for monocrop systems. And monocrop systems, sustainable. I remember growing up, my mom was a smallholder farmer, basically, and we had a 12-acre farm in our rural home. And I was just amazed when I was thinking back that on that particular 12 acres, she grew about 12 different crops. That's just a small piece of land, but with 12 different crops. So we had everything from maize, we had sorghums, all different types of millets, we had cucumbers, we had some indigenous leafy vegetables, we had some legumes, the bambara groundnuts, the cowpeas, beans, everything on that 12 acre. So it's only now that I'm like, wow, we were trying to tell them to grow just maize, monocrop, and yet they were already doing this crop diversification. So as I was looking at it, just like, okay, maybe there's something to learn even from, what our moms, our grandmothers have been doing. We can learn something and maybe bring some of these technologies that we have now to accelerate the improvement of these crops. So I'm just going to look at what are these crops that nourish, how are they important to our agri-food systems, and as enablers of sustainable cropping systems, what opportunities do they present to us plant breeders? What varieties are needed? What are the important traits relevant to the system's complexity? And what approaches should we employ for genetic gain in farmers' field? And I'm just happy to say there's so many experienced breeders in this room. We have worked with farmers for many years, and I've read a lot of literature from what they've published, and it's good that they're in the house and we can tap their brains as well to see how we can improve these crops. Okay. So what are these crops that nourish? There have been so many different names that we've referred them to as indigenous and traditional food crops, neglected, underutilized crops, species, orphan crops, lost crops, forgotten crops, all negative sort of connotations about these crops, but now we have rebranded them to opportunity crops. So I'll just talk later on what sort of opportunities do we have. So because of all these names that we had for them, there's not much investment that has been put to improving these crops. And the majority of them, they've poorly developed value chains, although they are highly nutritious. And so they can help our soils as well. And but our farmers, like my mother that I've just talked about, they've been growing these crops. Yes, the yields are low at the moment. However, these crops are resilient and they possess certain desirable traits within traits that are important to the communities that are actually growing them. And they are well adapted to local conditions and useful for climate change adaptation. So, what is the importance of these opportunity crops? So globally, we've actually seen that they can provide global food and nutrition security. By the way, my mom is now 97 years old, and she lived on these crops. So yeah, I mean, it's so amazing when I think about it now that, wow, she used to eat a lot of these, and look at her, she's 97. So they provide nutritional diversity, they contribute to sustainable food systems under climate change because they are adapted to the local harsh conditions. And they also enhance agrobiodiversity within farmer fields and home gardens. So like in Zimbabwe, where I grew up, you would find some of these crops. Like I said, my mom had 12 different types of crops in her fields. In the home gardens as well, you can find some of these. And they're also culturally important, and that's why they've preserved them for these many years as well. And besides nourishing us in terms of nutrition, they also have a lot of medicinal properties. And they're a source of income to rural farmers, and often it's the women. And so they have actually created niche markets in local economies, and we find a lot of rural people going into the cities selling these crops. So there is potential to increase demand and scale up the crops. So as well, they serve simultaneously to harness and protect local knowledge. So the vision for adapted crops has been mentioned, where we're looking at building resilient food systems grounded in diverse, nutritious, and climate-adapted crops in healthy and fertile soils. So I was privileged to have been part of the workshops that happened in Rome as well as in New York, where we actually listed some of these crops, and we're involved in some of the discussions. So we're looking at where to plant them, what to plant, what crop management systems, how to apply diverse crops. So I won't empty out what the next speaker will speak about, the vision for adapted crops and soils. But as readers, as we think of these, where to plant, what crop management systems to use, should it be business as usual? And are there any lessons that we've actually learned from breeding of the big three staple crops, the maize, the wheat, the rice? I think we can answer that during these sessions. So there are lots of opportunities for plant breeders. Most of these crops that we're talking about, they are already part of local food systems. So they are socially acceptable. We can easily include farmers in participatory plant breeding. It won't be a huge hurdle. Most of the seeds of these crops are locally sourced, home-saved, exchanges between neighbors. Production systems do not require large amounts of fertilizer or other agrochemicals, so it's cost-effective and environmentally friendly for production. And currently, they are often grown as mixed genetic populations. So genetic diversity is present to enable their improvement. And most of them also contain alleles and mechanisms that enable them to grow in poor environments and for resilience under stress. And as I said, women do play a significant role in the production and conservation of the crops. So this offers also opportunities for gender empowerment. And so we can also think of gender responsiveness breeding as we think of the breeding. We have other networks like the African Orphan Crops Consortium. They listed about 101 of these orphan crops, and they're targeting or sequencing the genomes of these. So there will be reference genomes available already. They've sequenced some of these crops. So this can also enable us to apply some of these modern technologies to the breeding of these crops to accelerate the breeding. So we know the plant breeding stages. I won't go through them, but it's important that as we think of the different breeding stages, we have setting of priorities and objectives. This is very, very important, especially for these crops, because they are already part of the local systems for our farmers, so we need to co-design with them. We talk to the farmers, find out what they know already about these crops. They have been doing the breeding in the fields, selections and all that. So we need to understand their seed systems. Plant breeding is part of the whole seed systems. We need to look at, before we do our breeding, what are the target product profiles and the market segments. We have the market intelligence, which helps us to identify the farmer and other stakeholder requirements for step change innovations and related investment opportunities. So it's very important to have dialogue with the farmers and find out more from them. What are the important farmer consumer preferences? What are the goals of your program? Is it contributing to biodiversity, to nutrition, or to gender equity, to farmer empowerment? We need to look at, as we breeding, the breeding efforts should focus on a set of traits that actually represent a major change in the value proposition for the farmers if we have to increase demand and scale up these crops. So we need to think ahead forward looking, where we look at things that respond to future requirements for innovation in farming and value chains. So it's very important for us to co-create, co-design with the farmers. And how do we approach the breeding? Like I said, participatory plant breeding would actually help as well, where we collaborate with the farmers in the breeding, from the setting of the priorities, involve them in the different stages of the breeding. This will also help, because someone actually asked me, why do you want to improve these crops? Aren't we going to erode the genetic base for these crops? So we really need to think about that because the farmers, they've been preserving that genetic diversity. So we need to understand the cropping systems that they are using. How will your new varieties that you bring fit into future cropping systems? Do you understand the whole planting and sowing that's involved, the soil fertility status, intercrops that are practiced, the plant densities that they use? So as we think about future breeding, we need to select under these systems as well. I know for maize, wheat, rice, we've been selecting under monocrop systems, but maybe we need a shift where we start thinking, okay, maybe we compare the two systems and see if there's any advantage of us, continuing with the monocrop, or maybe we shift to the multi-crop. So I was just looking at, there is a paper that was published by Moore et al. 2023, where they showed different systems that you actually find on farmers' fields. So as I was looking at this, and I'm like, wow, some of these, like the field scale crop diversification, D there, it doesn't come even close to what my mother used to do because we had almost 12 crops. And I'm just thinking, okay, some of them were in row intercropping, some of them were like strip cropping. And so we had different types of cropping systems in there. And then I'm thinking, like the maize that we were getting, we don't even know how, like we were just planting it mostly in monocrop for cash. And then we had some land races also that we had, the OPVs that will also be planted like in some of these cropping systems, and it worked. So we need to think about this as we do our breeding. We have VAX fellows here. It's something that you need to think about as you do your breeding. We have the VAX breeding leader here. I know there are different VAX breeding teams, and maybe it's also something that we need to think about. And what sort of traits do we consider in multi-crop systems? So we're looking at the objectives that we have. The objectives should represent the more diverse systems that there are. These are like they have some diverse rotations. There are some alternate season crops. So the whole ecosystem, different service crops that are there, the intercropping systems. So there are different types of systems like I've shown in the previous slide. So what sort of traits do we focus on? So the goal is still productivity, right? And the yield stability, the post-harvest quality, disease, insects are still very important, but maybe we include other traits as well. Like the previous speakers were talking about how our soils have been degraded. So we also need to think about that. Some of these crops help a lot to replenish those soils. So rhizosphere, microbiomes, maybe we need to think about that. How do they benefit phosphorus, nitrogen, water use efficiency, and all that? So we need, as we do selections, look at whether the plants that you're selecting will enhance positive interactions or they reduce negative interactions. Then you can make a decision then. So breeding for multi-crop systems also requires teamwork. Teamwork is important. Should we go alone as plant breeders? No, we need other support disciplines. We need socioeconomists, we need soil scientists, we need plant pathologists, we need everyone that can support breeding. We need to detect the G by E, but also by M, because I think the M has been neglected a lot. We've concentrated mostly on the G by E, and the management we have sort of put it aside as plant breeders. So VAX fellows, think about management as well as you design your programs. So you can test under monocrop and multi-crop systems and see if there is any significant rank changes between those two different systems. And if there is no significant changes, then maybe just go for one system to reduce the cost as well. And some of the concepts that we consider, we've been thinking about general combining ability, specific combining ability. Now there are new concepts that you need to think about, general and specific mixing ability. Also some of the new concepts that you need to think about when you're looking at specificity of the genotype compatibility in intercropping systems. So think about this as well, where we're testing genotypes with a wide range of intercropping partners. So if you have genotypes with high general mixing ability, it means they have good performance with a wide range of partners. If they have high specific mixing ability, it means compatibility with a limited set. So just as you look at your GCAs and your SCAs, also look at these different concepts. So to accelerate breeding, we are not doing away with the genetic improvement technologies. We still need them. So you can still apply all your genetic technologies to this breeding as well, and any other tools that can be used together with breeding to accelerate the breeding, they're also important. So in closing, a lot has been said about climate change and how it's devastating our agricultural productivity. And we know that agriculture also contributes to climate change. And so we need to adopt agricultural practices that contribute to capturing some of this excess carbon generated by agriculture and other industries. Plant breeding and other agronomic practices and development could actually contribute to incredible yield improvements in the changing climate. And I also just want to end up by saying that we also need to look at adaptation to climate change for our plant genetic resources. It's very important. So both in situ and ex situ conservation are important to maintain diversity of our species, populations, and varieties. We don't want to erode the genetic basis of these important crops. So diversified farming systems are important. So management practices, like I said, look at the G by E by M as well. Practices that can increase diversity, they tend to increase also resilience to the various effects of climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julia. Fantastic. And Julia, I love how you focused on co-creation with farmers, especially women farmers, and the focus on breaking silos and building that teamwork that is so necessary for VACs to work effectively. I now have the honor of welcoming Laura Rasmussen, an associate professor in the Department of Geosciences and Natural Resource Management at the University of Copenhagen. Please give her a round of applause.
Very much. And before I begin, then I would also like to say thank you very much for the invitation or to the organizers for putting together such an exciting program. So what I will do here is that I will really dive into agricultural diversification as an alternative to simplified agriculture. And to reveal the very positive results up front, because this is going to be a very positive presentation. Then we did this quite big study, and we did actually find that agricultural diversification is positive both for people and for the environment. And I should also say that this study was not done by me alone. It was a massive team effort done together with 58 co-authors, including SEEK. So yeah, they should have much credit for this study as well. Okay, so why did we do this study? We basically did because we wanted, as I said, to look into an alternative to intensified agriculture. And I believe that, and that was diversified agriculture, and I believe that diversified agriculture is very relevant for this group, as we have also heard in the presentation so far, because these forgotten foods, or maybe I should call them opportunity crops, as Julia just named them, these often tend to be grown in more diversified agricultural systems. So if you, for example, look at this new compendium of forgotten foods in Africa, then many of these crops are grown in much more diversified systems. And when we started this study about 5 years ago, then there was a lot of scattered evidence across the world that diversified agriculture is positive for the environment, and especially biodiversity. So that was kind of well known. But the evidence on the social outcomes of diversified agriculture, that evidence was much more scattered. And that basically also meant that we had very limited evidence on the potential trade-offs and synergies between the social and the environmental outcomes.
And that is in many ways obvious because we all know that it requires a very interdisciplinary research team to both go out and measure the yields and the biodiversity and the labor cost and all those different dimensions related to the potential benefits or pitfalls of agricultural diversification. So how does this study start? So it did, as I said, a bit more than 5 years ago. And at that point, I was based at University of British Columbia. And we were a group of 10 researchers sitting together where we had all studied agricultural diversification in some form or the other. And what we talked about was that it would be really interesting to see if we somehow could try to identify all this scattered evidence that we knew was out there and try to see if we could somehow harmonize all of it, bring it together, try to make these different, very separate case studies speak to one another, and then see what we could get out of that. Because that is also often the only way to have policymakers listen to what you're saying. That is, unfortunately, if you have some more general evidence. So we initiated this broader request for data sets based on 3 inclusion criteria. So the first one was that the data set should have measured at least one diversification practice. And ideally, then the data set should also have some control sites or some sites with less diversification. So we basically wanted this gradient of diversification because it wouldn't make sense for us if all the farms in a given data set had exactly the same amount of diversification, then there basically wouldn't be anything for us to measure on. So then the second inclusion criteria was that the data set should have measured at least one environmental outcome variable. And then the third inclusion criteria was that the data set should have measured at least one social outcome variable. And I will be honest and say that this started off very slow. So we started with about 6-7 data sets. I think it was very unclear to people what they were doing, what we were actually trying to do. And there was slight reluctance also for people to share their data sets. But then eventually then they found out what we were doing. And then the whole situation changed. So in the beginning, it was me sort of having to email different people saying, do you maybe have a data set that will fulfill these 3 criteria? But then after people found out that this might actually be a worthwhile exercise, then it changed. So people started sort of like turning to me and say, hey, we have this data set. Does it maybe live up to what you're looking for? And that whole process became a little bit of both a blessing and a curse to me. On one hand, it was wonderful to have a new data set included, but then on the other hand, then it basically meant like redoing the whole harmonization effort every time we had a new data set included. So we ended up with a total of 24 data sets, and those data sets represented 2,655 farms. And what is quite unique about this study, I think, is that we decided from very early on that all the people who had collected the data and had the contextual knowledge about these different data sets, that they were heavily included in the analysis. And that was all the way from defining what agricultural diversification actually means, up until sort of like validation of model results and interpretation and so on. So we would also run our models for these different subsets of data and then see, okay, does this make sense in this context? Our model results robust also, and so on. And I think that whole process of involving all the people who had the contextual knowledge about these different data sets, that was key in hindsight, because I certainly personally do not have the necessary knowledge from diversification in Brazil and Indonesia and Germany and so on to know whether this was sound. And so that was the reason why these 58 co-authors really became key in in the whole process. Okay, we had these 24 data sets, and the whole data set, the total data set presented many different contexts. So we had like blueberry farming in Canada, we had strawberry farming in the US, we had sort of mixed agriculture in Brazil, we had winter wheat in Germany, we had these small-scale maize systems in Malawi, agroforestry in Ethiopia, oil palm and rubber in Indonesia. So really a lot of different farming systems where diversification was happening. Okay, to give you, this seems a little bit, yeah, okay. So to give you a sense of some of these diversification practices also that actually included the nourishing foods that is the focus here. Then we, for example, had integration of trees in the maize systems in Malawi that Sieg also talked about. So that would, for example, be integration of mango and papaya trees in the maize systems. We also, from Malawi, had maize and pigeon peas brought up again, and groundnuts in a rotation. And then we had mixed cropping of maize and enset and pumpkin in Ethiopia. So that's just some examples that are relevant here. To show you a little bit how this diversification gradient could also look like, then I've taken one example from our strawberry systems from California, where you on the left hand see these very simplified strawberry monocultures. And then on the right hand, you see a much more diversified strawberry system where it was with flower strips in between the strawberries. Okay, so what do I mean when I say diversification in this context? We worked with 5 broad types of diversification. So we basically wanted to go well beyond just crop diversification. So the first type was temporal crop diversification, and that could, for example, be crop rotation of different crops. But then we also had a non-crop diversification. So an example of this would be flower strips, as I just showed for California and the strawberry systems. Then we had soil conservation, where people would, for example, incorporate residues or compost. Then we had water conservation practices that could be in the form of contour farming. And then we also worked with livestock diversification. That has not come up so far today, but that was quite important for us also. And we had that as, for example, the number of livestock species. So basically accounting for whether people had like sheep and goats and so on their farm. Okay, how did we score each of these more than 2,655 farms in our data set? I will walk you through this with non-crop diversification as an example. So for non-crop diversification, then we worked with 6 different types of diversification practices. So that would be hedgerows, windbreaks, flower strips, beetle banks, forest strips, and then other non-crop diversification practices. And then each farm would then have a score between 0 and 6, depending on how many of these practices were present on that farm. And a given practice could not be scored double. So it would be up to the people who had actually collected the data to assess which of these practices were present and then make the scoring. So that is just one example for the non-crop diversification, but we did this for all the 5 broad types of diversification practices. And when I say farm, then we also did it for all the different fields. So if a given farmer had multiple fields, then there would be a score assigned to each field, because you can imagine that if a given farmer has a field here and a field like 2 kilometers away, then we would need to know what is going on the different fields, not just at the sort of aggregate level. Okay, so that was the diversification. Then now I turn to the outcomes. So both the environmental and the social outcome variables. So for the environmental outcome variables, then we worked with 3 broad categories. So we measured biodiversity, and that could, for example, be in the form of the richness of the birds or bees or beetles on the farm, depending on what made sense in the given context. Then we had ecosystem services. That could be soil carbon stocks, pest damage, flood control, whatever also made sense in the given context. And then we had reduced externalities, and that was basically whether there was application of chemical pesticides or synthetic fertilizers on that particular field or the farm level. Then for the social outcomes, then we also had 3 broad categories. So first, food security. That could, for example, be measured in the form of a dietary diversity score or farmers' food expenditures. Then we had human well-being. That was a very broad category. So we had 20 different sub-indicators under that one. And that could, for example, be the labor requirements or the mental well-being of farmers, the value of the agricultural production. I just say this to really acknowledge that it goes much beyond just economic well-being. And then, of course, we had yields. Okay, so it's quite important for me to say that we did never dictate how data contributors should measure any of these outcome variables. It was completely up to people how they had measured these, and we included everything that they had measured. So, for example, for food security, I will give that as an example. Then, as I said, some people measured it as food expenditures, other farmers or other people measured it as the dietary diversity scores for farmers. Some people measure it as the household food insecurity access scale or the number of hungry months. And if some data contributors actually had measured multiple indicators, then we would also take both of those and then scale them and take the average. So we really included everything that people had measured. Okay, so now I will turn to the results, what we actually found. And this is where I say that it's quite positive, because we see that more diversification strategies, so the 5 broad categories, or more diversification practices, so those are the practices under these 5 broad categories, that those actually lead to positive outcomes for both in the environment and the more social outcomes. So on the left figure for F, you see for the outcomes for the number of strategies, and G, that's the number of practices. And then the size of the flower petals here, that's proportional to the effect size. And I should say that when I say effect size, then I do not make any claims about causality here. We are basically talking about associations. So what you should be focusing on first is the red bar. That's the outcome for the biodiversity. We see that is very positive for both the number of strategies and the number of practices. And then also we see very strong positive effects for food security. That's the light blue color. I do also want to highlight here that we do actually not see any yield losses. We do not see any yield gains, but we do not see any yield losses. And I think that's quite important also in this group, because that's also, it's often an argument used by farmers to say, we do not want to diversify it because we will lose out on the yields. But that's not what we see here. Okay, so diving a bit more into which strategies are actually working. Then we see the especially positive results for biodiversity. So again, the red bar here for the livestock diversification, the A chart, and then also the soil conservation, that's the C. So the 2 big red bars here. Then for food security, it's the same picture, but we also see very positive results of the non-crop diversification. I do also want to highlight that we do see some negative results. And that's, for example, for non-crop diversification in relation to human well-being, then you see that I will just point to it. It's here where it's negative. And one explanation for this might be related to the labor requirements here. But again, I think another important takeaway here is that we do not see any yield losses in any of these cases. And I think that's really important to highlight. So a question I have often been asked since we published this study is like, how on earth is it possible for diversification to bring about food security when yields do not increase? So for some reason, then that's a little bit counterintuitive to some people, but I think it actually makes very, very good sense. Because if we take the non-crop diversification as an example, and let's just take the example from Malawi, where you have mango trees and papaya trees integrated into the maize system, then if you measure food security as a dietary diversity score, then these fruit trees will provide the consumption of a very nutritious food group, so the fruits or the vitamin A, rich fruits and vegetables, and that you will be able to detect that using a dietary diversity score, even though you don't see these yield increases for the maize. So that's the explanation for why we can see positive effects for food security when we do not see these yield increases. And then again, I think the labor requirements in this example might explain the negative well-being outcomes. So I want to also take a short step away from our study here and then back this argument up by some work done by one of my postdocs, Emily, who's also here today, because she basically looked into the effects of having trees on farm for people's micronutrient adequacy rates in Malawi. And what she found based on a sample with a bit more than 400 women was that sourcing food from on-farm trees, that actually has very positive effects for both zinc, vitamin A, and folate adequacy, both in the dry and in the wet season. So she has made this work. And we don't see positive effects for iron in both dry and wet season, but we do see it in the dry season. So that is just to back up this whole argument that the food trees on farm can actually be a very, very positive thing. Okay, but going back to this, the big study with the 58 co-authors, then what I've so far have shown you is that we have these positive effects for biodiversity. We also have these positive effects for food security, but we then wanted to look into whether these positive effects go hand in hand. So basically whether they occur on the same farms. Because so far it could have been that all the positive effects for biodiversity were seen on one subset of farms in our sample, and then the positive effects for food security were seen on a different subset of farms. So it's really key to see whether these things go hand in hand. And that is what I show in this figure. So the win-win situations where you have positive outcomes for both, those are illustrated by the black dots here. And then what we really don't want to see is the lose-lose. So those are the green dots. And if I can direct your attention to the bottom two rows in the figure, then we have the number of strategies and the number of practices. And then the first line, that's the effect for biodiversity and food security. And then we see these two very big black dots, indicating that these things actually come together. It's not that they occur on separate farms. So that is again backing up this positive story. Then the final thing we wanted to look into was whether the surrounding landscape around the farms actually matter for which effects we see. And we wanted to test this intermediate landscape complexity hypothesis. And this hypothesis says that you can basically only achieve positive outcomes for the environment in these landscapes that are sort of in between. So where you have 5 to 20% semi-natural habitat left. The hypothesis says that in the landscapes where you have a whole lot of semi-natural habitat, then there's nothing further to be gained. And then on the other hand, in the landscapes with very little semi-natural habitat, then there's so little nature left, so you can't achieve anything positive. So it's really only in that middle category. And then if you look at this figure, it might be a little bit small for you to see, so I will just explain it. Then if you look at the top one, that's for the biodiversity outcomes. Then in the middle category, that's the orange dot. And so we do see the strongest effects in those middle landscapes. But what is really worth paying attention to here is that we do also see positive effects in the complex landscapes, so those with a whole lot of nature. So that tells us that there is something to be gained across very, very different landscapes. And if we look at food security, then it's really interesting because then we see very strong effects also if you look at the bottom ones for the number of strategies and the number of practices. We see that the black dot is on the far right, meaning that there's a lot to be gained in the cleared landscapes. So those landscapes where there's very, very little nature left, even in those landscapes, we can achieve positive. So I will now end with sort of some reflections on how we move forward from this. And I think this whole study illustrates that we really need a new way of thinking. And as has been mentioned also today, then these development initiatives have for long promoted simplified cropping and increased input use, but we really need to think in a different way. But I don't think we can ignore that transitions to diversified agriculture, that will require financial support. And starting to diversify will also require labor and access to training, knowledge, land, and seeds. But I think that there are a lot of lessons that can be learned from areas where communities have actually found ways past these barriers. So we have seen that, for example, in Malawi and Ghana, where it was really about the social networks. So these sort of social networks with farmer-to-farmer experimentation and training and teaching and sharing, those have actually really allowed farmers to diversify and be interested in diversifying. And then my final slide here is about how research for development can support drivers of agricultural diversification, because even though this was quite an undertaking, our study, and I'm quite relieved that it's finally done, I must say, then there were many things that we did not manage to do. So, for example, I don't think we got to a stage where we can really say which practices that work well together. Like, does it work best if farmers implement flower strips together with a certain type of crop rotation, or is it like crop residues that work best with a certain type of crop rotation? We really need to know more about this. And then we need to know more about the time lag before benefits are to be achieved, because that's also key for farmers. If they are to diversify, they need to know when they can actually get the positive outcomes. It's not enough for us just to say you will achieve positive outcomes. They need to know when exactly and when those outcomes will be achieved for the different practices. And then my final point is that I think we need to know which mechanisms that are actually linking a specific practice or combination of practices to biodiversity and food security. So there's more work to be done here in order to know exactly, okay, so how is increased use of compost and flower strips and trees on farms specifically linked to these biodiversity gains or food security gains that we see. So on that note, I would like to say thank you. And if you want to read more about this study, then it was published in April, and it's a very, very long supplementary material with lots of information. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Wow, Laura, and it might be because I'm not a scientist, but I've never seen a study with 58 co-authors. So congratulations on bringing all those people together and making it so interdisciplinary, amazing work. I'm going to try to keep us on time. It's about 10:30. If we could come back at 10:50 after our coffee break, that would be wonderful, so that we can, get all these workshops going in the afternoon. Thank you all. We'll be back in 20 minutes.
much money do we invest in fertilizers? Can fertilizers increase yield? Absolutely, and we need to be investing in fertilizers. But for a farmer who is concerned about feeding their children, the plot on the left is starvation, the plot on the right is not only feeding their family, but probably also selling some maize at the end of a drought. So we need to be thinking differently. We need to be prioritizing practices that are good for the farmer as opposed to practices that are good for the global economy. And this is just one example of those. We heard about some others earlier from Dr. Rasmussen, looking at diversification. We'll talk more about that later. Okay, yes, we can, and yes, we will. Positive. So crops and soils, an integrated holistic approach, as was highlighted by Anna earlier. The most fundamental decision in agriculture is what to plant where. And often those are the two decisions that we just assume have already been made and we can't affect. And so we focus on the management. And we saw in the last slide, management can have a pretty darn big effect, even if we are already stuck with what we're planting and where we're planting it. So when we think about VAX, I think thinking about it through the lens of human nutrition is incredibly powerful. I was trained as a soil scientist, sometimes referred to as an agroecologist or a rangeland ecologist or a soil physicist. It depends on the day, okay? But I'm actually not interested in that. And I'm at a point in my career where I can admit I was never really interested in science. And I'm still not. I was interested in saving the world. And if you want to save the world, we have to save that 36% of the biomass. That was such a great figure. 36% of mammalian biomass is us. Right? And another 60-some% is the livestock that feed us. So if we're talking about saving the world, for better or for worse, we got to save us. And we gotta have smart people in the next generation that are going to save the world. They have to be smart. To be smart, they have to have good nutrition. So it all really comes down, if we're going to save the world, about human nutrition for now and forever. I love this series of slides. We were down in Guatemala earlier this year, and that's Anna, as you can see, with a nutritious sweet potato in her hand. Unfortunately, this nutritious sweet potato is being grown in the wrong place with the wrong management practices. And I can see that as a soil scientist just based on the colors. So this soil profile was upslope. This is already extremely eroded. We're already down into an AB horizon. It looks like an A, but it's really an AB for those of you that are soil scientists. That means that's not the topsoil. Okay? But there's still some left here up because there was some regrowth of forest and it was a little bit protected. What you're seeing this color here, that's that. Okay? And this is continuing to erode. So those first three decisions, where to plant, what to plant, great, we got sweet potatoes. And then how to manage. How can we manage this piece of land, which is probably going to continue to be cropped in a way that it is sustainable? So what's an opportunity crop? I'm going to skip over this. Others have defined this much better than I ever could. Why is it important to match land use with sustainable potential and improve soil health? Again, I think we've addressed this pretty well. So back to VAX, building a supply and demand for a diverse range of crops. And we haven't yet talked today much about demand. We haven't talked about markets, and VAX, in fact, has largely focused on the supply side and will probably continue to a large extent to focus on the supply side. But we are increasingly looking at demand and how we generate demand as we continue to work on supply. So back to crops and soils for human nutrition and the VAX investment framework. And this was presented in one of the earlier presentations. And I just want to drill into it just a little bit more because we are finding that it's a useful way to help those who would argue that we just need more maize, that we need to be thinking differently. Because an awful lot of the people, I would say the majority of the people that I talk to who tell me we just need more maize, and anyway, people are going to already, you know, they're going to produce maize anyway, and all the systems are set up and so forth. They tend to come at it from a financial perspective. And so if we can then come back at it from a financial perspective and say, okay, where can we maximize our return on investment? Well, that then turns the question around and they have to answer that question. And often, maximizing return on investment is not adding another bag of fertilizer or increasing the productivity of a maize seed or a soybean seed by another 3%. It may actually be in intensifying production on one part of the landscape and abandoning production on another part of the landscape and letting it go back. And so that's that slide that I showed earlier. I'll just see if we can go back without, no, okay. They've actually, USAID is funding a lot of greenhouse work, okay? And it was, and people have different opinions about greenhouses and the benefits and the costs and the environmental costs and so forth. But in this particular case, what it was doing was we were talking with farmers who were saying, yeah, you know, actually, I think I'm just gonna not bother producing on that less productive part of my field, which also happened to be the part of the field that was eroding, because now I can grow 3 times as much in that greenhouse. Okay, well, you know, maybe there are some opportunities here to combine some of these more intensive approaches that, yes, involve more plastic, involve more irrigation, and involve a lot of other techniques. But if we can do that, then maybe we can get into some land sparing. So thinking about which of these decisions is going to be the one that's going to have the highest return on investment in research and the highest return on investment for the farmer who's implementing that research, I think is something that we really want to be thinking about much more critically. Kevin Fugley, who's with the Economic Research Service here in Washington, who I've never met, but I read his papers voraciously, because he takes this sort of ROI approach to looking at where are the biggest investments. I am often referred to as a soil scientist because my terminal degree was in soil science. Sometimes it's not about the soil. Sometimes it's not about the crop, and that's okay, right? We have limited numbers of years on this earth, and I'm not going to spend my entire time being a soil scientist if that's not what is useful. So part of VAX is taking a cold, hard look at what we're doing and asking ourselves, is this the best, highest and best use of our time? Great. Avenues. So I'm going to wrap up and just focus on what is VAX actually doing. So we're trying to do 3 things. One is shape the policy environment. There's some tremendous opportunities. I was talking with Iqbal earlier with NASA Harvest about some of the work that they are doing, and I hope maybe, I guess you're not making a presentation, but if we could somehow integrate this conversation about insurance programs and about subsidies into our conversation here to figure out how we can leverage money to make it easier for farmers to make the right decisions that will increase diversity, stability, biodiversity, food security, et cetera. How can we leverage those kinds of levers? I realize we may not have the right mix of people in this room, but I think we've got at least 1 or 2 people with economics background. So let's take a look at that over the next couple of days. Mobilizing resources, obviously we're trying to fundraise as much as we can. This is not about the US government funding a bunch of stuff. This is about the US government working together with partners to increase the amount of resources that are available for the work that you all do. And finally, changing the conversation. And I think this is the group that is best placed in many ways to change that conversation. Resource mobilization, we now have 4 multi-donor funding mechanisms coordinated through an implementers group. These are the 4 that are working together on that. More than $200 million has already been mobilized. This list is growing. We have a VAX champions. So some of you in this room actually are representing VAX champions. It's a way to basically elevate and promote activities that are being implemented by various institutions that are aligned with VAX in one way or another. The VAX community practice, where's Tiffany? Did we lose? Okay, she's not in the room. Tiffany, who's the co-organizer here, has been spending a massive amount of time in getting the community practice going. I know that there are several lead authors on some of the papers that are coming out of this. If you are not currently involved, we would certainly invite you to join the community. So how can we join the VAX movement? I'll just list 4 ways. There are many others. First, participating in the community practice. We have regular webinars, and we are also have organized a number of different activities to move VAX forward. We're really relying on and leaning on the community practice. Engaging with other disciplines. We heard, a suggestion that we need to look more closely at the microbiome. I would also suggest that we need to be talking with McDonald's marketing professionals. They may not be willing to introduce our crops into their menu, but boy, are these people smart. There was just an article, I think it was BBC or the Post, I can't remember where, talking about how effective McDonald's is in taking people who are not managers and making really good managers out of them. I think they could have written a parallel article on making people who are not marketers into really effective marketers. So what can we learn? Collaborating with our current partners, certainly representatives of the CG. Most of you are in one way or another already a VAX partner, but also just trying to expand that. And I just want to make a pitch for the National Agricultural Research Systems. I work for one of those actually in the United States, the Agricultural Research Service. We fortunately are incredibly well funded to the tune of about double of the CG's budget for just our NARS. But in many cases, the NARS are not as well funded, and I think it's an incredible lost opportunity or missed opportunity. And finally, transforming our own research and the institutions that both fund and apply our research to policy and management. So with that, thank you for allowing me to join you. I really appreciate it, and thanks to Danny for hosting.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Give him a round of applause. I loved hearing more about VAX, and I loved hearing your perspective, Jeff. As we transition to our first panel of the day, I want to ask Ava, Gunter, Bembai, Eric, and Manjiro to come to the front of the room. And I think we need an extra chair as well. I'm going to sit there. It's up to you, Kate. This is your show.
I'll bring you one, but it's not gonna look pretty.
That's okay.
You can't count.
Okay.
Use this one? Yeah. One of those, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. You can all take a seat, sit wherever you want. Give them a round of applause as they make it to the stage. To see you. I'm really, really excited about this discussion about soil and crop improvements that can help smallholder farmers build resilience. So I'm going to introduce each of you, starting with Ava Weldzine, a freelance consultant with Seed and Diversity. Give her a round of applause, please. Gunter Hemrick is a senior advisor in the Office of the Chief Economist at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. Give him a round of applause. But keep the energy up, everyone. Bimbai Chimonyo is a systems scientist with CIMMIT. Give her a round of applause. Eric Dankwa is a professor of plant genetics at the University of Ghana and founder and director of the West Africa Center for Crop Improvement. Round of applause. Manjiro Rutenberg is a senior fellow at the Ford Foundation. Please give her a round of applause. So since I'm moderating, I really hope that this can be a discussion where you all interact with one another. where you can build on what one another says, disagree if appropriate, take those fist fights outside, however. But I really do want this to be a discussion. And so my first question is both, I think, simple and complex, and it's for all of you. I'm wondering if we can talk about how you see VAX as an opportunity to create resilience and for farms and for farmers, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. So maybe, Eric, I can start with you there at the end. You all have to share your mics.
Okay.
They should be, should be on, maybe? There you go.
Good. Thanks, Danny, and good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Let me commend those who envision the VAX. In fact, I can call myself a VAX champion since 1984, when I did my undergrad research on Bambara granules. I saw tremendous opportunity for that crop to take Ghana forward, but no one put a Ghana CD in that crop. And so how can we take such a crop forward? It's a crop which is resilient, drought tolerant, fixes nitrogen, very delicious. In fact, it was said in folklore that that was the first meal that a bride cooked for
That's cool.
the spouse.
Uh-huh.
Very delicious, if you like, green legume. But when you look at productivity in Ghana, you hardly get about 0.8 of a ton in farmers' fields. How can you take such a crop to scale? That's why I want to commend the those who envision the VAX. There are a range of crops. And looking at the soil, if we can co-develop the crops and the soils that have opportunity to fix, especially Africa, I believe we'll travel miles in our effort to meet food and nutrition security in our world. The yields of such crops are so low, and there is the science available.
Sure.
Which can change the paradigm, which can change the narrative. So if we can put together communities of practice that can work on such crops with the necessary investments to take them to scale, I believe before 2030, we can run in places like Africa.
I love that you're starting on such a positive note. Thank you for that one,
But
Jared.
there is a strong if there.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I hope I can come back because there are a number of things that I need to talk about because I've walked this journey for over 3 decades as a serious academic. And there are a number of things I would like to put on the table.
Thank you so much, Eric. Wanjiru, I'd love to hear your comments.
Thanks, Danny. It's an honor to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I had a quick chat with her. I'm feeling a bit cantankerous today. So
Good. I love cantankerous. I love a little bit of tension.
I hope you all won't mind. As and I want to first identify myself as an insider outsider, an outsider because I'm trained as a political scientist. That's incredibly useless when it comes to crop breeding, but I think useful, totally useless for breeding. It can be useful because I'm trained to look at power and power in society. And so what I'm holding and listening to these conversations is a tension about, are we sure that scientists and governments, policymakers, now turning attention to these crops is not going to ruin the ecosystem? We know and we've seen in the United States, for example, when it comes to marijuana, the minute marijuana got legalized, who started making money off of that does not look like who is still in jail for crimes that they were imprisoned for when marijuana was illegal. And so these policy shifts don't always benefit those who have been doing the work. I actually really need this community to think harder and tell us more about how those farmers, especially those indigenous communities who have been growing these crops and who have preserved those genetics through traditional practices, are not going to come out the losers in you all getting interested in this.
I mean,
I'm worried about that.
thank you. I think a lot of others share your worry. It's not just about economic resilience or nutrition resilience. It's about how you create a way for farmers to make this their own, and especially African farmers. Bimbai, I wonder what your thoughts are on how VAX can create resilience in sort of all its forms in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere.
Okay, thank you for that question. Just going back to what Eric was talking about, how the bride was meant to put the Bambara groundnut as more of a rite of passage into a family, which for me, who's now looking at issues of gender and social inclusion, might actually come off as maybe not always, something positive in this current world, in this current rhetoric that we have, where we talk about, do we then have technologies and systems or way of thinking that allows for equity and equality that's kind of like suppressive, because I know how difficult it is Bambara groundnut is to cook. So I see VAX as an opportunity for us to actually look at what has been done, what are the gaps, and what we actually need to do going forward. It can come up with the boundaries of how we interact with these crops, come up with the boundaries how we can actually have policy, as Manjiro was trying to elucidate, can be an enabling environment for the uplifting of these crops. I was talking to Eva and Melinda when I got into this room, and we were having a conversation on should it be issues of mainstreaming or us as scientists or a community of practice looking at how we can fit into a certain trajectory within existing food systems. Do we want our farmers to be custodians of these crops and therefore maintain the status quo, or should we use these as a pivot or a springboard for them to actually enter into new market opportunities, create new value chains, and have farmers that want to transition into commercial farming create opportunities for themselves around these crops. So I think VAX can be a gatekeeper, if you want to say it like that, or it could be a facilitator of conversations at different angles to allow processes to happen. I was looking at the P's. We talk about people, planet, place, and practice. I think these are the conversations that we've been having since morning, right? And I think VAX is situated in the middle where it can actually then do the politicking around these concepts.
Yeah, I love that you're asking both of those questions, and I'm sure that there are many more that as VAX grows and as the movement grows, there'll be those questions asked. I just want to stay with you for one moment. You talked about uplifting crops and you talked about gender and Eric's comment before. How can we make sure that VAX is uplifting the empowerment of women?
So a lot of it is, do we understand women within a particular context? Do we understand what they mean for that context and how they operate within the boundaries of the particular context? It's easy for us to come into an area and say that, no, we want gender empowerment and therefore we want things of equity, but are we destabilizing the culture, right? By then saying that, no, Bambara is too difficult to cook for women and therefore all the brides that are supposed to cook Bambara no longer need to, right? So we need to then be cognizant of culture tradition, but also again, of the trajectories of societies. So looking at their visions and then incorporating it into the research agenda of these particular crops. So how do you uplift women within this particular context is by understanding the context and the trajectories that they want to then.
They need to be at the table. They need to be in
They
these
need to be
discussions.
at the table, it needs to be definitely collaborative.
Yeah.
They need to co-design, collaborate with all the cores that we can come up.
Yeah.
They should have a place at the table.
Absolutely. Thank you for all that. Gunter, I'd love to turn to you and talk about how VAX can build resilience. Is it building resilience, and where do you see that having the sort of most impact?
Thank you very much for the question, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here with all of you. I look into the room and I see the food system, right? We're all parts of the food system. We are part of the food system in terms of consumers. We eat every day. We are part of the food systems in terms of being researchers. We make decisions about research. We are part of the food systems in terms of decision makers, how funding will flow to different areas. I think what I like about VAX in terms of the contribution it's made, it's that it embeds this food systems approach and agri-food systems thinking, while at the same time having very concrete entry point. The entry point through seeds. Also, a seed is a system in itself. It contains so much information that can drive change, and the same with soils. I mean, soil can be a system, and you look at what FAO does in terms of the Soil Fair project, it's building a system that allows good decision-making about soils. However, I also want to caution a bit in terms of looking at resilience too much linked to farmers alone. I think we need to think about resilience as something that pertains to the society as a whole. That's really critical because, for example, if you look at Africa and the low-income countries in Africa, most of the farmers are actually net food purchasers. So they don't live off the food that they produce, they buy their food on the market. So we need to make sure that the agri-food system as a whole functions, and the agri-food system as a whole provides the services we need in terms of better food security and nutrition, income for farmers, coping with climate change, with land degradation, with the loss of biodiversity. All of these changes need to be looked at systems level. So the VAX initiative and the VAX actions actually need to be seen in the context of this broader food systems transformation. And there are globally, but also in the countries, there are so many initiatives that VAX can link to. And I'm just thinking of a few, maybe if I just give a few examples. FAO did the report on the true cost of food, saying that more than 10 trillion globally are the cost, the external cost of our food system at the moment. And this needs to be managed. And that requires also that we look at the global support and the national support that goes to the food system, and to look at how kind of repurposing can happen of funding flow, so that in the spirit of what wants to achieve, that we work at this, at the field level, at the seed level, at the soil level, but also at the policy level.
Absolutely. I love that you brought that up, and not to put this all on farmers. They're already doing a lot. Resilience can't be their only, we shouldn't put it all on them. We all have to work on this. Thank you for that. Ava, from your perspective, I'm wondering how you see VAX enhancing resilience across sub-Saharan Africa and again elsewhere.
Thank you for the question, and thanks for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here and learning about VAX. I'm very new to VAX, and so my thinking comes actually from sort of the background of my experiences that are much more localized, context specific. My experiences in developing the sorghum varieties for a specific agroecology West Africa, really, and working directly with a lot of the actors, especially farmers that are managing seeds and managing their cropping system. And that we're thinking, what would they think about what we're talking here? And so then my concern is that we are easily talking at a very high policy level. And in the end, what makes a difference is capacity, agency at a much lower level within the context, like what Vimbai mentioned, understanding the context, the cultural context, gender context. What are the actual limitations? The complexities are really high, and really making a difference takes time. So but there are fantastic opportunities, which I like to think about in the context of diversity, especially genetic diversity of these crops that we're mentioning. The experts for many of the crops where research has not been able to make many advances for a variety of reasons. Expertise for managing that seed, managing those varieties lies with those farmers. So I would really like to see or encourage everybody to look at those local experts, work with local experts and build capacity, especially social relations, interactions to further that way, building up bags from the bottom.
This absolutely has to be built from the ground up, doesn't it? Vimbai, if I can turn to you, we heard at least one speaker, maybe more, talk about livestock this morning. And in addition to crop diversity, which is obviously very important, we need to consider the impact of both humans and animals on the soil, because crop diversity alone isn't enough, right?
Yeah, so I think one of the morning speakers was talking about planetary health, and one of the concepts under planetary health is also the One Health concept when you look at people, soil, and animals, right? And a lot of the things that we have been doing, especially within CIMMYT, is trying to see how we can transform our spaces to speak to better crops for the soil, better crops for animal health, and better crops for people. So in terms of the opportunity crops that are there, you find inherently farmers have used these residue for animals, but it's not well documented. How can we as VACs ride on that wave, right? I think as Eva is trying to say is that the custodians of this information is already within the farms. But how can we actually have the system become more of like a closed system where the animals can actually bring about some benefit to the production of these crops? So how do we use the manure so that we can then manage the fertility aspects? So we actually need to set up research agenda that looks at these integrated approaches, right? And I don't know if we've got anyone from livestock here, but they need to be in this room as well, contribute to these discussions and saying that, oh no, there is this, like Bambara, right? It's very fibrous, the plant itself. But a certain proportion of it is digestible within like cows and all these other ruminants, right? But we need to then say, if we are going to look at the functional bits, as Sig mentioned in her presentation, what are they? How can we actually breed for these and incorporate them into the existing genetic pool?
Yeah, I'm glad mixed crop livestock systems are becoming part of this conversation. Wanjira, you had a comment about that earlier, didn't you, about sort of the focus on plant forwardness, and maybe that doesn't work everywhere?
Yeah, who are we asking? Who is it that needs to be adopting a plant-forward diet? I think there is a need for certain levels of geographic specificity. I think it becomes awkward to go to a Maasai pastoralist with the need to adopt a plant-forward diet. right? So these policy conversations that we have, especially here in DC, become global policy. They do, right? Like, so I also, again, I told you I'm feeling cantankerous today. I don't know why. So I'm speaking with zero filter. Forgive me.
They ran out of coffee, that's what happened.
I miss the coffee this much. Maybe that's why. Actually, that is wrong. Okay, now here's the thing. Okay. You know who I think is missing in this room is the farmers in Kansas and Iowa. Are they not farmers? Is this conversation completely irrelevant to them? Why are we having this conversation only for and with Africans, Asians, and perhaps Latin Americans a little bit? And if we're talking about like the overall topic of varieties that are adapted, is it only for Africans and Asians? Where and why are we dividing agriculture? Where did this division come from? And again, the degrees I have are useless for plant breeding, but they're really helpful for analyzing power and global power. Why is it that this is an Africa conversation and not an Iowa conversation? What are you people telling the farmers in Iowa about varieties that are adapted? What do you tell, like, and I loved the sister from Europe who did the 50 author paper, because that was the first moment she was talking about winter wheat in Germany. That was awesome. I think we need to actually have a more broad-based global conversation and stop pretending like Europeans and North Americans don't grow food. Because when you actually then bring them to the conversation, you start having conversations about how did we get into this mess? So, how farmers in Iowa and Kansas grow wheat and soy and feed pigs, which is why we're telling people start eating plants again. How they feed pigs and grow soy to feed pigs is a massive contributor to the mess we're in. And now we're talking to African farmers about how African farmers are going to change how they do things as part of their contribution to fixing their mess, but you're not going to tell the people growing soy to feed pigs to stop changing that. Does that seem fair? Like, it seems not only unfair, but horribly inefficient if what you're actually trying to do is fix agriculture's contribution to climate change.
Yeah, if we really want to transform agriculture, we have to include a lot more voices in this
But
conversation.
they're not here, are they? Is Vox talking to farmers in Middle America?
Yes.
Awesome.
Thank you for that. Gunter, I know you had a comment about the livestock.
Yeah. I think the conversation that we are having, it shows how important and how powerful actually a systems approach is. I mean, when we look at the benefits that the food system should provide to people and the planet, then we need to ask, where are the pockets in the world where introducing animal-sourced foods into the diet has a huge benefit, and where is already too much meat eaten? So it's a conversation that is part of applying a food systems approach to this specific theme. The same is true with looking into the details of the how-to. I mean, growing livestock can be done in very different ways, and the impact that livestock has on climate change or greenhouse gases differs depending on the methods that are applied. And part of the food systems approach is to find these approaches, the integrated crop livestock systems that allow sustainable livestock farming as part of a broader transformation of the agri-food systems.
Thank you for that. Eric, Gunter's been talking about, looking at this as a system, having a systems approach. And I know for VAX to work and for, the work that you were all doing in this room to work, you need partnerships and collaborations. I'm wondering how we can really make sure that the relationships are built and structured in a way where African, Asian, Latin American, American, North American, and South American farmers and scientists are really leading this.
Thanks, Danny. I think we are talking, we talk to scientists and farmers across the world. And I believe it's important for us to focus this conversation because if we want to bring everything on board, we might not achieve much. Let's look at data. We look at the world over 30 years. You look at the 2000, for example, 8 World Development Report. It told us something in the world. That one, if you looked across the world, Africa had serious challenges. That was a fact. At the same time, at the FAO, and you remember, we had a conversation at the FAO 2005, 2006, 2007. That is what gave birth for the Global Initiative in Plant Breeding Capacity with Eric Waitman and co. Today, look at data. The CADEP Biennial Report. What is in is troubling. And for me, I think it's important that we focus. No country in Africa is on track. That's a fact. And I think even the numbers there are overbloated. Because if you went on the ground, the situation is very troubling. You are talking about a continent which has huge potential, but we don't eat potential. So I want us to, we don't eat potential. I want us to focus this discussion. This week, I believe you've seen the Times Higher Education World University rankings. I believe you've seen it. 2 Chinese universities are in the top 15. I hope you've seen that. Could you look back 1990? Where were the Chinese universities? You didn't see them anywhere. I want to see 5 African universities in the top 20 rankings. How do we fix it? If we do not fix that, it is likely that we'll be talking about food and nutrition security in 30 years' time in Africa. So let's go back and start rethinking how we fix the world. And fixing Africa has implications for fixing the world, in my opinion. There are initiatives to bring all of us together as scientists, as farmers, etc. And I've been in several fora where we have met a diverse range of people putting their heads together to see what we must do in our world. And so for me, for this conversation, I would want to focus. The first thing I would want to say is that, and perhaps I'll tell a story, Sikh love stories. Over the past 3 months, I've been in about 5 countries, starting from China. I was in Hangzhou. I visited Zhejiang University. A Chinese professor my age, we've been around for quite some time. He said to me, Eric, when I was growing up, not only me, our community were hungry almost every time. And he's talking about the mid-60s, when in Africa we had envisioned the kind of Africa we want. Now look at us. That's the vision. We can put our heads together and fix Africa. Look at the quality of education. For me, if we fail to fix education in Africa, it is unlikely that these conversations will take us anywhere. And I want to focus, and I wish that VAX would focus on capacity. But I look at the numbers and I'm troubled, Danny. I'm very troubled. Like you give the change to capacity, it can't work. And I'm challenging the State Department in the USA, the USAID, and the African Union itself. Where is the African Union in this room? They are not here. And FAO, we have to understand it's not it's not rocket science.
It's not rocket science.
It's not rocket science. And Africa is not, and let me emphasize this, Africa is not going to use another pathway to develop. No, if Africa is going to use the same pathway that other countries have developed to develop. And what is it about? We are talking about opportunity crops. Where is the opportunity? And remember, farmers, you can fool them but once only. And so if the varieties, and I recall in 1986, when I was writing my master's thesis, I said, an essay I submitted, I said, the time has come for African farmers to throw all the varieties they are using away, and for us to put in their hands varieties which give them hope, but varieties which they themselves have contributed to developing. So we need to use good science, technology, and innovation to put new varieties in the hands of farmers and in real time.
Yeah.
And that has to do with capacity. So Zeke, I cannot commend you enough for this capacity initiative, but we have to get back to the drawing board and ensure that we are working together a new paradigm. Look, and we think about the women more than most people, like the Bambara, how we get women on board. We want to change the cooking time of Bambara. You cook Bambara in 10 minutes for your spouse, or your spouse cooks the Bambara for you. So, I think, Danny, there are serious things we have to talk about. There are opportunities we've got to explore together.
I'm so glad you brought up the need for capacity building, the need for education. I'm sorry that this conversation has been derailed by Bambara, but I think that the quote of the day from Eric has been, "We don't eat potential." So I want to continue this need for collaboration and partnerships, because that's the only way that VAX will work. So I wonder, Bimbai, if you have a comment. CIMMYT is so good at creating partnerships and collaborations. How can that help VAX do the work that Eric wants it to do?
Yeah, I think Eric has actually stolen my thunder.
I mean, you stole his earlier.
Equal partnerships. I think that's one thing that is always baffling when it comes to how we define a partner. Do we stand as equals in the conversation, or there's one that has a begging ball and the other one actually has a giving ball? And then you just cover that with a veil and say that we are partners in this conversation. So one of the things that we have actually mentioned in our new strategy of CIMMYT is that we just don't want a partner on paper, but we want someone who's equal.
A relationship.
A relationship, right? We could have good days and bad days, but we'll stay in this relationship until it's no longer faking it until it works. It's about actually making it work. So that's one way. But there's also this behavior change. I think as we are in our different institutes and entities, we actually need a shift in mindset that leads to a positive behavior change, how we view partnerships. I do understand sometimes there is one that has the knowledge and the information, but then we all have what we know and we do understand what we understand. So there's that need for us to shift mindset for positive behavior to then encourage equal footing in terms of our partnerships.
Yeah, the only way food transformation can work is when you change our mindset.
And things like that, yeah.
Dave, I want to come back to you about this issue of relationships and how that has developed in your work and making sure that there are equal partners and collaborators.
Yeah, thank you. I was just thinking that I should say something about this issue. And especially in relation to the capacity building, my experience has been that collaboration with farmers can build capacity directly without also everybody going to university right away. Though I will never reduce the importance of building up the capacity of universities, but this experience of building actually agency among farmers, among farmer groups, building capacity to actually take things into their own hands, to express the powers that they can have, and realize the opportunities that are actually available relies on taking them seriously at the outset, building their own relationships, ensuring that organizations work, and that you can build up networks of farmers, farm organizations, farmers that can network with researchers in different research initiatives. And I really like to hope that you can talk to Paul Roger a little bit more, because they've been supporting these farmer research networks for several years now, and it's really taking shape and showing that you can build capacity on a large scale. It's not small, and impact lives, and it is much faster than trickling down seeds from somewhere. And I think that way also really important to look at the policy level. There are issues in seeds that are really slowing things down. Seed policies are not to farmers' advantage in most countries. So yeah, I want to highlight this effectiveness of, as a plant breeder, you can make change not only by your variety, but how you work to develop that variety.
Thank you so much, and thanks for bringing up that farmer to farmer connection and south to south sharing. That's so important for this. Good, Jared.
Does this work? Oh.
Yeah, let me see if I can turn it.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think what we are touching upon is entry points, right? Entry points for change. And I just wanted to add to that conversation a few points. FAO and CIMMYT have created a partnership to take WACS forward. And I think what's important for that partnership is to have a solid theory of change. I mean, to see what are the entry points that are likely to bring about good outcomes and change. And this theory of change has actually three broad blocks. Mm-hmm. One is around the productivity of crops and soils. I mean, many things that we have already talked about this morning. Another element of this theory of change is the policy environment. How can you instill policies that trigger change, and what are the decision-making processes that can be influenced? So that's the second area of work. And the third area of work is really about the value chains and the market functioning and the supply and the demand for the crops. I think all these three areas are really powerful areas to start with, of course, in addition to capacity development and the other things we have mentioned. I want to highlight one point which only once appeared so far in the conversation, which is about gender. I think it's really important to look at the role of women, and the fact that 2026 will be the International Year of the Women Farmer is a huge opportunity, I think, also for taking WACS forward, because if you look at the opportunity crops, gender plays very strongly into that conversation. So it's important to keep that on the radar and use that also as an opportunity in addition to the crops themselves.
Absolutely. Women hold so much power and so much opportunity. Did you want to go next, Mumbai?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what he said about issues of gender. So one of the things that we're doing under the Agroecology Initiative, which is a DGRI initiative, is trying to see how we can mainstream agroecology. And one thing that we realized was mechanization is a driver for uptake of these holistic approaches. But one thing that we realized is that it has like good and bad outcomes to this. So we brought in threshers for the small grain, which is also part of these opportunity crops. And we were saying that we wanted to reduce the drudgery for women. Right? So obviously gender focused. First year it worked wonders. Women were saying that they now had more time with their families, and they spent most of the off season not preparing the grain, but doing other extracurricular. When their husbands found out that these machines did well and could be a source for income generation, they took over. Something that we thought we're introducing to improve women's participation in mainstream agriculture was taken. Why? Because it was an opportunity. Now, let's go back to this opportunity. We're talking about improving breeding. We're talking about if we improve the agronomy and the breeding of these crops, do we then go full circle to what happened to the other crops when they now became more of the man's crop? So I think we need to be careful how we sell this story to the outside world, or the farmers, the African or European, whoever, and say that we go back to the issue of context, place, culture, and all these things. We need to be mindful.
It goes back to the mindset point you brought up, and we have to be so intentional about this. Jiro, we haven't brought up sort of the funding and donor community and their role in this. In the past, foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation, they're trying to fix now some of what they did during the Green Revolution. How can the funding and donor community transform along with the food system in a way that will benefit farmers especially, but also the scientific community?
I think being better learning partners, and again, back to that, what Vimbai is saying about who comes to the table with a begging bowl and who comes to the table with a giving bowl. And often those who have resources, whose job it is to allocate resources, feel they don't have to sit and learn. And so there's a lot to be said about a learning mindset, a humility of recognizing mistakes that have been made in the past, investments that looked really smart at the time, whose results down the road we couldn't foretell. I think and here I'm speaking in my own personal capacity, I think it matters to have diversity and representation amongst the ranks of donors. Having those diverse perspectives at the table when decisions on resource allocation are being made is an important, and that's an important internal conversation, right? That is happening in foundations. I think there's, and funders, and again here I'm speaking my personal capacity, I think funders are human too, and everyone wants to be special in their own special, unique way. And what I have seen, again, when Jiro speaking out of personal capacity, what I've seen is when there emerged one big funder, a lot of funders left the space and ceded the ground. And I worry we haven't had a robust debate on what food systems should look like. And that, I think, has not been helpful to the ecosystem as a whole when other funders exited or ceded space. And I really hope for the day where that can get rectified, where there can be more balance and more arguments. There is value in cantankerous people.
There is value.
There is value in argument. It forces you. It forces you to find where you disagree, and it forces you to find where you agree. Now, Eric and I will go to the streets on the capacity building question, like together. I'm right there holding the placard with him. We have to have African voices that are trained, that are performing and ranked at equal levels as their foreign counterparts, debating these issues. I loved listening to that keynote by our sister from KwaZulu-Natal because the considerations you brought to the table, you talking about your mother and how you grew up, we need that knowledge, that perspective is as important as the science, and she brought both. And we do ourselves such a disservice when we deny ourselves that kind of expertise at the table as an ecosystem.
That's right.
Farmers are the original scientists and researchers. I want to make sure we get to questions, but I want to give you all 30 seconds for a call to action to this audience. Eric, you can go first.
Thanks, Dan.
30 seconds.
I would like to appeal to the global community that there is nothing better than local solutions to local problems. And capacity built in Africa for Africa is one of the best strategies ever conceived and then taken forward, like what we have done at the West Africa Center for Crop Improvement. It has cut the brain drain by about 90%. And we have the evidence to show that when you develop the Africans in world-class institutions in Africa, they remain in Africa and serve Africa. A few of our graduates have migrated to the global north, but that is 10%. Look at the reverse, 90% would have been lost. And Africa is where we are because of the capacity and the lack of political will. Let us engage governments in Africa and let them understand that it's all about investments in people.
Investments in people.
In
I love it. Thank you. Ava.
Yeah, I'd like to appeal to everybody to really think diversity at different levels. And I really liked your way that we need these discussions among people with different points of view. And I think also in terms of developing our ideas, we need to try different alleyways and different avenues for progress. But we also need to really look at the diversity of people who can benefit from the different ways of doing and building relationships between these different types of people and different ways of looking at developing their livelihoods. And I would really like to look that way also at diversity of delivering more diversity, not just single optimized solutions. Let farmers choose among the options for their specific context and looking at ways to do that effectively.
Put farmers in the driver's seat. I love it. Thank you. Wanjiro.
In our massive excitement, very justified excitement for this work, let us not forget to be humble and self-critical and aware that it is possible to leave things worse than we found them. So let's pay attention to that.
Unintended consequences. Thank you. Goodbye.
With genetic gains of most staple crops actually coming to a plateau, we find ourselves in a unique situation where a lot of researchers are getting into the space of these opportunity crops, some of them not always with good intentions to advance their research profiles. I think one of the things that we can do as FACS is to actually create these boundaries of how research can, the research agenda rather. What is the research agenda and whose research agenda is it? It's important for us to know that the agenda should be set by the people and the places that need these crops the most. And one of the things that we need to do is also come back to the true values of what we should be doing as researchers for those that are less privileged.
Thank you so much, Mumbai. Gunjar, you have the last word. 30 seconds.
Thank you. 2 points. One is agri-food systems differ country to country.
Yeah.
So let's give countries a chance to put the pieces of the puzzle together, put countries in the driver's seat, in addition to all the local action that is needed. Second point is, if a farmer puts a piece of seed in the soil, there are risks of what happens next. If there's a climate induced emergency, so whether the seed will grow or not will depend on how much a farmer invests in caring it. So we need to understand